One of the major statistics that keeps showing up again and again, both homelessness, incarceration and trafficking, is that a lot of these, if 80% in Los Angeles, for example, of traffic victims actually were in foster care. 75% of those incarcerated in America were in the foster care system at some point. 50% of homelessness were in foster care at some point. The main reason, I think, why, and forgive me for speaking for the rest of the team, but the reason why we are all so passionate about this is if we catch up the problems upstream, which is reforming the foster care system in the United States of America, as well as being able to navigate reunifying children back to their homes or finding them a forever family, a safe and loving family, if they can't go back to their families globally, then we would actually catch up all of those things upstream and reduce significantly the numbers of what we're seeing play out.
Welcome to another episode of the Hope Strategy Podcast, this special mini-series for the Orphan Myth campaign. Go check it out at orphanmyth.org. Today we had an incredible conversation with Carrie Lloyd. And this was one of the more fun conversations I've had, really diving into Carrie's background and hearing her journey to becoming a pivotal role and a player on the Orphan Myth team. Straight from Carrie's website, which is carrielloyd.live. Carrie is a woman unafraid to ask tough questions to a generation questioning the relevancy of their lives in a modern world. As a published writer, life coach, and pastor, Carrie navigates life's many barriers, from helping people fight and recover from addictions to abolishing codependency. She has written numerous articles from fashion to relationships for Glamour, Magnify, Grazia, Company, the Huffington Post, and City, and spoken about sex, love, and communication in venues throughout the UK, US, and churches worldwide, as well as her frequent appearances on television and radio. Originally from London, Carrie currently resides in Redding, California, where she has completed ministry training and works at Bethel Church as a pastor. Once a fixture in the advertising industry, Carrie launched into writing and journalism. Fascinated by relationships and emotional health, Carrie has drawn upon her own experiences to inspire others. She's the author of 3 books. The most recent one we discussed on the podcast was The Noble Renaissance, Reclaiming the Lost Virtue of Nobility, which was published by HarperCollins and is out now. Carrie, we talked about her background and the way that she grew up, and I asked her pretty early on in the conversation, I was like, so, you're a pastor now, but from reading her bio and the research I did, it wasn't something that she had set out to do, as a young woman or as a girl, even, what did you want to be when you grew up? But the answer when she was a kid wasn't that she wanted to be a pastor. She actually had quite a journey to get there. And her upbringing and some of the stories that she told from growing up in London with her parents to, moving to the United States eventually becoming a pastor and now being involved with some amazing causes, the one we're talking about here, the Orphan Myth Project. It was really, really cool. She is an incredible human that has done some really fascinating things. And she's so bright and smart and talented. And it was such a pleasure to meet her and have this awesome conversation and have her shed some more light on this Orphan Myth Project, the Orphan Myth campaign, and, educate me and all of you listening on how we can be more involved and how we can, help out with this campaign. So again, it's orphanmyth.org. Incredible week on the Hope Strategy Podcast with this Orphan Myth miniseries. Thank you so much for listening. Please enjoy this conversation with Carrie Lloyd. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you've heard me and Josh talk about MWI, which is our digital marketing agency. If you're new around here, this may be a first introduction to MWI. We're a full-service digital marketing agency that specializes in everything from website design and development to search engine optimization and all forms of paid advertising, whether it's paid social advertising or paid search advertising, content marketing, digital PR, social media management. Basically anything a business needs to strengthen and grow their digital footprint is what we do over at MWI. The website is mwi.com. And for any listeners of the Hope Strategy Podcast, I'd love to offer a free 20-minute consultation with yours truly to talk about your business, to talk about your goals, to understand, what you need to be doing from a digital marketing strategy and action plan standpoint in order to yield some results and grow your business online. So please reach out at mwi.com/hope strategy. That's mwi.com/hope strategy to sign up, and we will be in touch. Now back to the show.
Something is happening in our world.
Time is very precious. I'm going to show you how great I am. Hope in the face of difficulty.
More than machinery, we need humanity.
Hope in the face of uncertainty. I'm better now than I was. I'm experienced now.
Changing the world can happen anywhere, and anyone can do it.
The audacity of hope.
This is the Hope Strategy Podcast with Corey Blake and Josh Steinley. I'm fascinated by your journey, as I know a lot of people are, and you've written books and you write a lot and you've got a lot of interviews you've done and stuff. But this journey from growing up, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but growing up to Baptist parents that were like ministers, right? In England and Manchester. That's why you've got that. Is Kate Beckinsale from Manchester?
No, she's not. Well, I actually don't know.
I hate to be the guy that is like the stereotypical American that's like, you sound like Kate Beckinsale.
Do you know Kate? Do you know Kate? Have you had with her? That's normally what
yeah. Well, really though, it sounds like, and I feel like I heard in an interview once, just being an interview junkie that watches all sorts of interviews. I feel like I heard that she was from there. Where's she from?
She's she's got received pronunciation accent, so I'm assuming somewhere in the middle parts of England. I was born in Manchester. I don't have a northern accent either, because we left pretty much when I'd love to know what my life would have been like if I had a northern accent. I think I probably would have had a lot more sense of humor than I do.
Oh, I love it. So let me paint the picture here, and then we're going to start back. So Baptist ministers, then you go through a kind of finding yourself journey and eventually spend a number of years as an atheist, and not just an atheist that's like, I don't believe in God passively, but it sounds to me like you were kind of we'll call it an active atheist. You were actively kind of in the pursuit of, no, God doesn't exist, and this is why. Is that correct?
Just a really mad one.
Just a really bitter and mad atheist. Okay. So then you go from there to, oh no, now I found Christianity again, and now I am a pastor. So then you become a pastor, you go to school to become a pastor, and then or what do they call it? Seminary or
it's ministry school that I went to.
Okay. So ministry school. So then you become a pastor, and now you've dedicated your life to spreading the good word of Christianity and the gospel, as, Christians put it. And that to me, like that, that's like 10 lifetimes in one, just that journey right there, knowing like the ins and outs and the ups and downs of that and the strife and angst that probably accompanied all that. So I want to figure that out if we can in a little bit. And then I want to tie it back to the Orphan Myth, and we'll talk all about that and what the project is and what your association with it is. And we'll get all the details out there. Tell me about growing up in England to Baptist parents, and why did that lead you eventually to become an atheist?
Yes.
Is that a good way to word it?
It is a great way to word it. It's the best I've ever heard it worded, actually. And I'm sure everyone can fill in the gaps for me. I think what's interesting is Baptists in England are different to Baptists in America. So whenever I would say in America I was raised by Baptist parents, there would be this gasp.
Yeah.
Like, no, they were great. No,
they just weren't Catholic.
Why is it? Yeah. Exactly. So they were really lovely people, and they had lovely community. They always were able to just bring in the masses. They just involved everyone. My dad bought an old school bus just so he could sort of move around the elderly, and he bought an old caravan because they needed a little vacation, and this was the poorest parts of Manchester. So I had a pretty brilliant childhood, actually, because it was very colourful and full of adventure in some ways, especially when it came to community. My father died when I was 23. But I hadn't really been taught by my parents. They dedicated me. They didn't even christen me. So they kind of said, we'll raise you a Christian, but it's really up to you what you want to believe, which I was very grateful for, especially.
Yeah, that's a good approach.
And so, but I do remember there wasn't much explained to me about the Bible. And so I sort of picked up snippets of it, and sometimes the worst parts of the Old Testament,
Yeah.
I was terrified and quite religious, and I'd made that my own thing. My parents hadn't made me like that. And I do remember, one Sunday, my father opens the stage of the church and opens this huge pool of water. And then I watch him half drown people and everyone's celebrating. because, and I'm like, are they celebrating because they survived? I don't understand what's happening. I was explaining to me what a baptism was.
Yeah.
So I kind of had to fumble my way a little bit. My parents just kind of let me soak it all in, but I didn't have much context sometimes because I was so young. So I created my own religion, and in the sense of very legalistic, didn't even say the word bum. If we were doing a Birdie song, I couldn't say the word bum in that song. So I was super, super legally suffering. And when you start to really struggle in life's problems, like lose your dad at the age of 23, he died very suddenly. And then I had 4 consecutive other deaths after that. You don't have the kind of intimacy or faithful relationship to actually navigate suffering. You're performing your religion if you're religious and legalistic. Mm-hmm. You don't necessarily know how to really hold on to it for substance and for tenacity and strength if it's not the real thing. So I got mad, I got bitter, and I remember
that happens a lot, right? In any religion, but it sounds like, there's a conviction that, and this isn't a religious podcast, I'm a religious person, you're obviously a religious person, we've talked to a number, but anything that you're that you're doing on the surface, but you're not truly convicted. So I don't care if it's like you're on a basketball team and you're just on the team because you're supposed to be on the team, but you're not really, trying or whatever it might be.
That's it. And I also kind of thought, I don't want to leave my religion to be that cliched. So I held on to it for 2 years after my dad died. And I sat down with a philosopher from Cambridge who was like the brightest brain I knew. And I asked him for 4 hours in a hotel foyer one time with coffee, going, just convince me to believe in God. I need someone to give me logical, realistic reasons why I should believe in God, because my life is a tattered nightmare. And I need some convincing, which he refused to do.
I was going to say a philosopher might not be the right person.
But he was also religious.
Okay.
He was Christian. He was the best friend to my father.
Okay.
So I thought he'd be the perfect person to talk to. But rightly so.
He wanted you to come to it on your own, though.
Totally. And so I left that hotel room as an atheist. And it was like everything was meaningless all of a sudden. Everything was monochrome. Nothing had color. And I didn't really know what it looked like to actually do life without God. So it was quite an insane time. And then started working in the advertising industry and the most different from, people just enjoying cocaine on office desks and smoking away and all the kind of crazy partying that you can imagine. So I went from sort of one extreme to another.
That is another thing that I've noticed is that oftentimes in some religions or groups, when somebody is brought up that way and is not saying bum in the song, and I won't take the Lord's name in vain and I won't drink a drop of alcohol, whatever it might be, then when those questions come and you can't get answers to them and you've faced trial and tribulation and you can't overcome it, then I've seen a lot of that where it goes from one extreme and then jumps to another extreme of, well, I guess I'm going to go try all the other stuff that I've never done before and see if I find fulfillment there. Right. And so
I was a bit of a wimp, actually. So I would just find excuses not to be taking cocaine by saying I was allergic to aspirin.
But I don't know if that makes you a wimp or that makes you incredibly smart and respectable.
Or just a liar.
Yeah. Or just a liar. Yeah, I guess. No, it was smart. That was a wise move.
But I became obsessed with kindness. And even though I was reading all the new atheists and the new atheists, and I was arguing every Christian I was ever meeting in a bar or a pub under the table because I had both materials sit with me. I could find arguments from both sides, and equally I was destroying people, cruelly destroying people under the table. With nothing still explained to me why I wanted to love someone and why I wanted to be loved and returned. And nothing explained to me why I would cry when I would see utter kindness and the substance of kindness. And so that became this fascinating research on kindness. And
so what is the explanation of that if you were to take, having been down that path, if you're taking God out of it or your belief system, your religious belief system out of it, what are the response? I guess what I've probably heard is it's a chemical reaction or something like that. It's more biological. What have you heard in your conversation?
Richard Dawkins would say, it's a chemical connection. It's another layer of connection between, mammals of some sort, an animal instinct of some kind, to validate our worth and significance in the world. But I was looking at the kind of kindness that people were self-sacrificing on an extraordinary stage. And of course, when I sat down and really asked who was the kindest person that we could have recorded on the planet, it always came back to Jesus. And so I started reading historical accounts of Jesus outside of the Bible, because of course I misused the Bible so often. I needed something fresh. And so I was looking at, the extraordinary impact that he had, his teachings on kindness, on character, on morality that actually undid people in their wounds. And so from there, I became just quite obsessed. And one afternoon, I sat in the back of my garden in England, nice summer's afternoon, with a Marlboro Light, smoking. And I said,
"Hey, another Kate Beckinsale thing."
Yeah,
maybe that's part of the voice.
And I wish I was Kate Beckinsale. Especially her relationship with her animals. I think it's a very sweet moment. I think, yeah, just being, I was sitting smoking, and I hadn't spoken to God for years, and I just basically asked him, "Hi, it's me. We haven't talked for a long time." And I just keep on reading about how Jesus really believed that his Father knew all the details in his life. And I don't know whether I believe that. I don't believe that you know the details in my life, because you've seen my journey, if you have. And I just need to know that this was personal, that this wasn't like that I'm one of a commodity of billions on the planet. And when I buried my father, there was this bunch of flowers on top of the coffin. About 15 minutes into the service, this white butterfly came out of the flowers and into the steeple. And the crowd had also noticed. I thought I was hallucinating. The crowd had also seen it as well. And cut to 5 years later, when I'm in the back of the garden smoking, after the many, many times I've been arguing against the existence of God, and I'm saying, I need to know that you see the details on my life. I exhale, I inhale, I close my eyes. I think that was a stupid thing to say. And I feel something on my nose, and it's a white butterfly.
Wow.
So it wasn't a logical argument that won me back. It wasn't someone's testimony. It wasn't some preacher on the corner of Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. It was a personal encounter because I'd asked a question. And in my anger, I forgot to ask questions, and I forgot to keep my hands open, for the answers of what I wanted. I needed to surrender essentially to the experiment instead of try and prove it.
Well, that's an amazing experience. It seems so often that's and again, the great thing about these these conversations, but anybody that doesn't have any sort of belief, Christian belief or a belief in God or something, you can always find a combative way to say any of this and, to go against any of these things. But the scriptures say, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God that giveth to all men liberally. And sometimes it's like, I don't know if it's pride or a inability to, get to that point or whatever, ego, but I've heard so many stories where it's just, and you know what, even if it's meditative, even if it's a personal thing, even if you're just trying to find an answer for whatever. I mean, I do it as a parent or as a spouse or as a, boss or whatever. In those moments where you're just trying to figure out what the next step is, it's just asking the question. And again, in your experience, obviously you get answers, right? And you're a great example of that.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back a little bit because you mentioned that you saw these examples of kindness and that it always stuck out to you, and you were impressed with the love and kindness that you had seen around you from some of these people. And I heard the story in some of the research I did that your dad was an advisor to Princess Di.
Yes.
And And I think it's timely, maybe just because I just watched that documentary on Netflix, like everybody else in the world recently.
Which one? Which one did you watch?
Well, not documentary. Sorry, the series.
The Crown.
Yeah. The Crown. The Crown. Yeah, The Crown.
Okay.
The Crown. But
okay.
you know, there's the story in The Crown documentary. What a loser! I called it a documentary. It's not a documentary.
I might argue that it is.
People think it is. I've been told it's not by a lot of people. Anyways. The king himself, or the prince, I guess, Prince Charles, said it's not a documentary. None of that is true. Okay. So I think it was probably, I remember looking over at my wife, and in this moment, she was choked up in this, you know, kind of emotional moment of the show. But Princess Di goes into, I think she was in Africa, and she goes into a hospital or an orphanage where there's a lot of sick kids.
Yeah.
And with AIDS, it was when, and she went and she hugged a kid, and that was a true story, and it was like shocking. But you told the story also of a similar incident with lepers, and your father had a foundation, which obviously we're going to get to the orphan myth. This is in your blood, right? These foundations that do good. But
yes,
she had an experience with she went and made a statement basically by her kindness with lepers. Your dad heard about it, so tell us that story. And I'm guessing as a kid that was impactful for you.
That story actually was what connected my dad to her. So my dad was the executive director of the leprosy mission. And, you know, majority of people think that leprosy doesn't exist anymore. It's never really talked about. It's certainly in America and Europe, but it is actually existing. It does exist. And it often comes under the name Hansen's disease. So when Dad was trying to raise money for this charity to help, you know, there's hundreds of thousands of people that have it, but they go into hiding still. The stigma's really bad. No one will touch them. Yeah.
But the truth of it is that it's actually not contagious, or not very, I can't remember but I lived in Hawaii, like I said, and I went to Molokai, the island where they banished, and I did the whole thing. And I remember, I mean, that was something else, because you see these people that were in the United States or in other parts of the world that were completely shunned by society, put on a boat, shipped to a teeny island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And not only that, but when you go and you see this place, it is on the backside of an island at the base of the largest cliffs. So you have in Hawaii. So on one side, you have just rugged cliffs. The only way to get down is on a horse or a helicopter or a boat coming into the shore. And they were just put in this colony and not allowed to leave and taken away from their family. And then science tells us later that, that was not necessary at all. And to this day, people still assume it is, right?
Yeah, it's literally, I think it takes about 2 years to contract it, which is why it went through families rather than passing by someone on the street. But, you know, there's footage of, you know, people in later stages of leprosy crawling down the street, because the disease is taken over so much and people throwing stones at them. Like it was brutal. Mother Teresa called it the loneliest disease in the world. And she actually had said to Princess Diana, if you want to really go and understand the real outcast, then you need to go and see lepers. And of course, they call it people suffering with leprosy now. They don't even say that word because of the stigma of it. Mm-hmm. So Diana actually stops somewhere at a random leprosy hospital, and she just basically done a detour, which wasn't planned. And so she went into this hospital knowing the paparazzi were following her. And she was good at this kind of stuff. She was always trying to break boundaries and be a pioneer in this stuff. And she basically comes to the ward. People are sort of running around going, oh my gosh, she's here. Weren't planning for this. But the doctor's like, Mom, no one's touched these patients for 10 years, only us. And she, in that moment, she takes off her gloves and she walks down the ward and she hugs every single one. She lets them feel her face because some of them are blind. And it's just this beautiful moment where my father in his prayer life behind closed doors was like, we need to expose this issue still. You know, we still have people in hiding. And so on the press, in the British press the next day, were the lines, don't do it, die. And it was a picture of her holding hands with a leper. And my father called Kensington Palace and said, I wondered if it's possible to just pass a message of thanks. And this was to the private secretary, a guy called Patrick Jeffson. And he said, because what she's done in 5 minutes, we've been trying to do for 120 years.
Yeah, with her influence.
Yeah. And Patrick said, could you just hold the line one more time, just for a minute? he came back onto the phone. He said, could you just say that line one more time? And he said, do you mean what she's done in 5 minutes we've been trying to do for 120 years? And then the next voice was Tony. And it was Her Royal Highness, the Princess of Wales. And she said, what I saw you guys doing out there is extraordinary. How can I help? And so there's something about saying thank you to people that are following the same things as you, as well as being constantly versed and educating ourselves on the real problems and the real dilemmas. I think sometimes we can be pretty arrogant in what we know. And I think we're constantly refreshing because the world's ever changing. So that's the same for issues like leprosy all the way through to orphan care. And so I think my father was a great inspiration to me, just in regards to reaching out to the ones that are passionate about the same thing. She cared about the outcast a lot because in some ways she felt outcast herself. And she was just I've got 100 stories about her, with her traveling with Dad, of what she would do, and just being quite naughty, but for the sake of humanitarian causes.
Yeah, I think again, going back to our biography, the Crown, I think that is one story they told very nicely. That was like, she did feel like an outcast. And so as a result, she did things that were against the norm because she didn't care about the norm, because she just wanted to do it. Seemingly she wanted to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And use and leverage her influence for good.
Yeah.
Which is incredible. And especially up against what she was up against, So what was you had the chance to meet her on one or multiple occasions, right?
Yeah, because she was, my father was basically her charity advisor from 91 to 97, to when she died. And she had 120 charities, and then she went down to 6 because just paparazzi were getting too brutal. And it was just becoming too invasive. On top of that, when she and Charles divorced, her title was removed, which meant the security levels weren't as high. And so, which, even with Meghan and Harry, I thought that was quite a choice for them to leave, because the security on some levels is less because of the governmental sort of provisions and entitlement that the royal family get. So on that level alone, Diana, needed to cut back in certain ways and go a little bit more private. And she kept on to 6, and one of them was Dad's charity. And some of that they believed was because, Dad really cared for her heart and wanted to make sure that she was covered, and Dad was incredibly confidential. So a lot of stories that even Mum and I don't know, because he kept all of them to themselves, and, long flights of long chats. And also it's his job to be a confidant. So part of that being a minister. So she did have a lot of trust in Dad. And, publishers were often trying to offer a book deal, to which Dad always refused. And sometimes he'd make up ridiculous things that completely threw them off, and red herrings, just to kind of waste their time. But
your dad sounds like is an incredible guy.
Yeah.
What a life.
He was a really brilliant man, and an inspiration, in the sense, very passionate himself. And I think he too, they sort of met each other because they both felt very passionate about being outcast. And Dad, in his own way, felt that sometimes. So he started a Hells Angels club in the late 60s, as a Baptist minister, and dug up the old church halls of it was an old disused church hall that they dug out the cellar to. And then he basically started and established a Hells Angels club in 1967 with 7 very violent boys. I
was going to say, like Hells Angels, like the motorcycle gang.
Yeah. So they were super violent on the streets of Abbey Hay Estate, which was at that time one of the most violent areas of England. And, but there was a time where people called the Baptist minister before the police. So Dad finds these guys saying, "Oh, you're just bored. You guys need motorbikes." And so essentially kind of set them up with getting them some bikes. And it went from 7 members, it was called the 171 Club. It went from 7 members to 1,000 members. It became like the coolest place to hang out. And, lifetime membership was 50 pence and you had a little badge. And what happened was they actually, I know I'm going off on a tangent here.
No, but please go.
It's a really cool story, and I'm still thinking about writing it up. But basically the bikers became known as the Heaven's Angels, not the Hell's Angels. They were often outcast an awful lot at the beginning. But Dad had actually created enough repartee with the police. And the police actually, some of them were members as well. And so of the club. So they would take off their uniforms and it became this very classless, beautiful connection with each other. You know, the bikes kind of removed a lot of the walls that society would normally create. Mm-hmm. And people were trying to close this club down and didn't like it, found it quite annoying, you know, because of the stigma of being a Hell's Angel. Yeah. But these were just boys really on their bikes having a good time. And the stories are just hilarious and wild and crazy. But Dad was like, there's 1,000 members now and we need to be more useful for the city. We've got to do something that's actually useful to people. And the police said, well, the bikes are still faster than ambulances. And my dad was like, we're not picking up people off the side of the road. Paramedics on the back of a bike. And they said, no, but you could deliver blood and drugs between Manchester and Liverpool Hospital. So they started doing, and he said, we can cut off the road so that you guys have just got free rein to go straight through. So they started doing what they called mercy missions from Liverpool and Manchester hospitals. It was essentially like one of the original blood services.
Wow.
And they became known as Heaven's Angels. And so these guys were essentially saving lives on the back of their bike. But back in the day, there were terrorists that were stabbing each other in the middle of streets in Manchester, you know. So it is amazing what kindness and love can do. That
is incredible. Does that still exist? Is it still a thing?
It does. It's not. It actually became because there were so many members and it was such a fairly small. There's a film room, there was a games room, there was the bike workshop. Yeah. It wasn't a huge space for 1,000 people, so he had to separate it to the BSA night, the BMW night, the Ducati night, the Suzuki night every night of the week. They became spin-off clubs. So actually the Suzuki Owners Club is still going. And that was originated from the 171 Club. So when Dad died, some of the Suzuki bikers rode behind the hearse, which was kind of awesome. But it's pretty awesome to just connect people with what they love and see communities thrive and see people thrive in it. Yeah.
That's incredible. What great background into your dad. Again, I like that we're talking about him so much. Sounds like an awesome guy. So you go through the atheist spell, we'll call it. You have that conversation with the philosopher, you leave, and then you have this amazing experience where you feel an answer to a prayer. Yeah. And then, so when you walked out of, so I'm going to maybe project this onto you and maybe I'm wrong, but when you walked out of the philosopher's office and you said everything lost color, did you feel a shift? Did you feel a change after that experience? Was it one of the kind of opposite moment of leaving the meeting with the philosopher?
Yeah, in some ways it was actually, if I look back at it now, I can think, oh gosh, that must have been an incredibly painful moment for our Lord. I think, of course it would have been. But what was interesting to me is because I kind of had so many expectations on God to provide and to answer my prayers, I wasn't really taking much ownership of my life. So one of the things that I would suggest was a benefit for this moment was that I actually had to start taking responsibility for my actions. And that was terrifying on all levels. And I think when I came back to my faith, it was a very, very different type of faith. One full of intimacy and honesty, one full of co-laboring, one full of conversations of needing guidance and wisdom, one that wasn't asking God to take away the pain, but how to navigate the pain when I'm facing it. The intimacy with God, the navigation of what the secret place actually looked like, because I didn't really have a secret place. You know, you don't need one when you're performing your religion, but you need one when you're actually living your faith and intimacy. And this is a real relationship that I had with God that goes deeper and deeper every day. But it was a slowly. I might have had that encounter in the garden of that moment going, oh, that was a really sweet touch. Like I felt very loved, and in my anger, you still were tender to me, you know? Yeah.
I've heard those moments defined as divine signatures.
Oh, I like
a little signature moment, right?
Yeah. And I would say the white butterflies, every time I see a white butterfly now, it feels like, you know, it wasn't the argument for the existence of God. No, absolutely not. You know, people go, well, that could have just been a coincidence. Mm-hmm. But because of the conversation I was having at the time, and because it's like my spirit was just so drawn to kindness. And when I saw cruelty, which was about 7 times a day in advertising, I'd be crying in the toilets. So my wiring wasn't working for the negligence of these good codings that we have been given the opportunity to kind of embrace. And so it was a step-by-step process coming back. And the more I was watching kindness modeled, the more inspired I was by incredible self-sacrifice, the more missionaries I was meeting to, Martin Luther King and what he was doing for civil rights, like these very powerful exchanges of self-sacrifice for the sake of the better, of the good of somebody else. But it just became these noble seeds that just inspired me. And I guess that's why I wrote the book last year on the Noble Renaissance, because I was what brought me back to Jesus was not an argument or a good logical, finally we found the answers.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah, it was this consistent layering of nobility that was often in the name of his name. And so for me, I'm like, there's something on that where I see someone give up or let love cost them something that just kept on making me weep and cry. And I'm like, it's interesting that moves me so much.
Yeah. And you're a brilliant writer. That's what you've done professionally outside of a number of other things, but you're a brilliant writer. You've written for every major publication as far as I can tell, and written some really cool stuff. But the book that came out, you said it was a year ago, is The Noble Renaissance, Reclaiming the Lost Virtue of Nobility. Yeah. The lost virtue of nobility. What other lost virtues are there? Are you going to write? Is there a series coming from this? The lost virtue.
I know.
The lost virtue of what else?
Yeah, of marriage, because we're now the most single generation. 18 to 14-year-olds are the most single generation today.
There you go. That's
lost virtue of marriage.
That's a great. Yeah, and then you could write another one called The Lost Virtue of Nobility in Marriage, and that that's a whole other. That's a whole other.
That's real. That's.
But
real.
what's the book? Tell me about the book. I haven't had a chance to read it. I stumbled upon it this morning.
I'll have to get a copy to you. It's a lovely little. It's my favorite book actually, and the response from readers has been really, really lovely. And they've said it, it was equally challenging, like it was a personal conviction to where I'm like, oh gosh, I don't want everyone to feel really bad after they've read the book. It was actually more about the fact that they were like, no, this is inspiring. It reminds me of why I get mad at certain things and how we can overcome those things. So basically it looks at the 7 virtues of what creates a noble character. It's essentially looking at what builds a character. And I think I was inspired by David Brooks' A Road to Character. That was the beginning of it, which I read a few years ago. And then I kept on thinking, a lot of people leave the church when we're not seeing good character. A lot of people challenge Christians when they're not seeing good character. Yeah. So what does it look like, especially in this day and age when you've got, we've got helicopter parenting or lawnmower parenting, where we're taking all the adversity away from our children, so they're not actually building character. There's that book that came out as well. What's it called? The Coddling of the American Mind and How We're Setting Up the Next Generation for Failure. Geez, I should probably read that, having children. that is the constant question and the constant struggle for like parents in my generation of there's so much to protect them from naturally. Yeah. But there's also just the absolute fact that they live in this world. And so where's that line with screens and with the internet and with video games and with whatever, walking down to the park by yourself, things that even when we were kids, it wasn't a big deal, but now it's just like. Well, you've got those memes, haven't you, where people are talking about when they were a 70s kid and it's them in the bath with a toaster. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Constant, pictures of how they weren't really all that cautious. The irony is we're more cautious today than ever before, but we have 48% less likelihood of unnecessary injuries or accidents than in the 70s. Yeah. So we're actually in a much more safer world. Is it because we're more cautious, or is it just? I know. I think it's a little bit of both. I think some of they're basically saying we're more anxious now and more cautious than ever before. Oh my gosh! So much more. But the chances of kidnapping or all these different things are so much less. Yeah. So, at what point? So, of course, we remove, or we see our kid being bullied in the playground, and then we want to go and challenge it, or we want to go and have a meeting with the teacher or the parent, and we essentially do the fights for them. Which part of that is animal instinct? That sort of makes sense.
Yeah.
What the book was essentially looking at is we really need to start going, so what are we going to do? How involving them in the adversity to go, so how do we approach this? How do we face this together? Until they can figure out how to do it alone. And that's where nobility comes from, is just this building of character through trial that allows you to get to a lot of Christians are really terrified of pain. One of the reasons why we ran to the church, some of us, was because we had some pain that we weren't able to get over ourselves, or we were just longing for a rescue on some level, which is a beautiful encounter. Of course, he's always there to help us, but we don't stay there. And if you look at some of the most profound characters in the Bible, they're incredibly fearless, full of courage, full of ability to take ownership of their own choices, but at the same time, be humble enough to be always taught and guided. So I kind of look at all these different character traits: humility, integrity, courage, wisdom. Perseverance was a big one, because that's exactly where you're building, especially, when Paul's talking Romans 5:4 of, and rejoice in the tribulations and the trials. And for that will be essentially, we'll create perseverance to character, character to hope. And so I was often avoiding things that I had to persevere through, but that would often leave me in a space of hopelessness because I hadn't built on my character. So I wasn't very good at perseverance, but I would look at the people that I was inspired by in their character and watch them just stick it out and stay in the difficult times and actually be very focused and very present. If you look at our Lord with pain, he was incredible with pain. He never avoided it, never tried to get busy or supplicate it with something else. He would literally make space for it and hear the wisdom of his Father in it. And that's, for me, I think, is the beauty of nobility. So I think some of it is actually just embracing. It talks a little bit about, I love to talk through stories because it's just, for me, I remember it better when I'm teaching. And so the book is full of stories of just very brilliant, amazing, noble moments. But it's not all necessarily famous activists or missionaries. It's also the Aunt Susan that humbles herself and makes coffee for the church service every Sunday, I tried to find some of the no-namers because it's actually quite hard to write about noble people because they don't really want to talk about themselves very much. They're just getting on with it. Yeah. And so I had to interview their friends or, those kind of things so you can get content or stories. Define
nobility simply then in this case, because I think there's a lot of different ways you could approach that, right? But what if you were in the sense that you kind of the lens you looked at it through, what
A.W. Tozer called it the excellence of moral beings. So essentially it's an exalted character. And I would say that a lot of the time inspiring Christians or people that have led incredible movements have incredible character. And so you often hear people go, that was a very noble thing to do. It normally has an essence of self-sacrifice. A lot of the time people hear nobility as aristocracy or royalty of some level, or the nobleman that you read about in the Old Testament. I think this is much more on the excellence of moral beings. And so I think people have been nervous to look at the excellence of morality because they're worried it becomes a perfectionist slant and that people are like, I don't know whether I can keep up to it. To be honest, it's exhausting, especially if you've come from a religious background where you feel like nothing is good enough. Yeah. So this is really challenging of like, no, you're allowed to make mistakes. It's just how we navigate those mistakes and how we clean up the mess. Yeah.
It's again, it's a common analogy, but that of a diamond, the way that a diamond is formed is just this immense pressure. Yeah. And if you look at a diamond as this really valuable, thing that you would want to attain, I've talked about that a lot as a parent or as a employer or when I was teaching, that's where good things happen, is that pressure. But if you stop because the pressure is getting too high before you get to reap the end reward, then so I agree with you 100%. And especially when you're talking about kids, since that's omnipresent on my mind, as a parent, but it's just that allowing that process and having faith in that process, to work itself out. This is a pretty specific question, but I feel like it ties into a lot of what you've talked about, a lot of what I read and saw, the book and everything. And then I think it's a good segue into the orphan myth. Right. But talk to me about self-worth. When you talk about your upbringing and your, I assume, and again, maybe I'm projecting, but knowing my own personal experiences and experiences of people that I care about, there's this game, the shame game that accompanies a lot of people that are trying to reach some certain level of whatever it is. I don't care. As an entrepreneur, it's something that I see where students I've had or people that I network with or whatever that have this constant shame because they're not quite as good as that next person. Or if you're a religious person, well, I do this, that, or the other. And so I'm not as good as the other people around me, or I'm not living up to the standard. And so people learn and a lot of times it's cultural or in a family setting or whatever, this shame tends to be abundant on people's mind, whether they know it or not, subconsciously or consciously. And obviously that then ties directly into where you make your meaning and where you define your self-worth and who you are. And so I just feel like that's a lot of what you talk about.
I talk about it a lot because I've actually found the power of people that, I guess as a pastor in, a fairly large church, I see repeated patterns of when people value themselves, they're incredibly helpful to society, a lot more so than people that are full of self-criticism. They're also often more successful. And I don't mean in the sense of wealth or anything like that. I just mean in the sense of connection with relationships. Mm-hmm. They don't sabotage when people are coming closer. They're often more humble because they have the ability to listen to criticism. If I'm constantly filling my brain and my mind with self-critical thoughts or shame, which I think shame comes from self-criticism, there is also a connection, I believe, between self-criticism and hopelessness. So you'll find people actually sabotage because they don't believe that it'll actually happen anyway for them. Why would it? It's never happened before.
Yeah.
And the self-criticism is basically you build a tank of just cruelty that not only won't allow, therefore, any more criticism to come in from other people that might be constructive and necessary. So we kind of push away and get defensive. But on top of that, we actually lose a lot of trust with ourselves. If you think about taking care of a little child and they're falling over, you don't beat them up and say, get up and start again, or get mad with them. You're very tender to them. You allow them to make a little, okay, let's try again. We're a lot more kind to that. And our heart is that fragile. It's that tender. So for me, when I'm trying to coach people through the art, and I do a lot of coaching these days on this, when I'm trying to coach people away from self-criticism, poor relationships, self-sabotage, or just these cycles, these patterns that essentially become damaging to the self, I try and build back the trust between the head and the heart. And what they don't recognize is the dialogue that's going on between the head and the heart all day, every day.
Josh, who's the co-host of the podcast, he interviewed me. And I have a whole journey of this process. That's another, I guess, innately. So anyways, anybody that's listened to all the episodes of the podcast will know that. But that there was a point in my life where I realized, and I think it was from, upbringing, whatever else, but that negative, it was subconscious, but it was just that constant association with at the end of the day, the way that it was defined to me was that I believed that all good things had to end, or no good things could happen to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that I'm getting what you're saying, that head to heart, that makes perfect sense.
Totally with you. And then we're reaching out for things that aren't quite available to us because it's confirming an environment that we're constantly making ourselves that says, it will be disappointing. And having to actually sever ties with expectations of disappointment is part of the process. And I recognize that in my own life, absolutely. I think but when I actually start to see people be so kind to themselves especially when they're getting it wrong, or finding more of a connection with self-compassion. They're so much kinder around other people, much less critical, much less judgmental, and they actually get much better work effects from people that work for them. If they're employers, you actually find amazing, so you start to see statistically the increase of morale and productivity in the workplace because their boss is finding ways to encourage them. It was this lovely story that I heard about, I think it was a Buddhist monk that was basically trying to lead a group of students into silence. And a couple of the Buddhist trainees, so to speak, were like playing around and being giggly. And one of the other students came up to the guru later on and said, were you not frustrated with the ones that were playing about and not taking this seriously? And he said, I'm not looking about where they've gone wrong. I'm looking at how far they've come. And I think that for me is probably the best place to start, how far we've come rather than how far we've got to go. And the power of self-worth comes from the inner dialogue. And I would say the people that have been in my life and mentored me, that's exactly how they approach me. And I come alive, I take more risks, I'm more courageous because I've got people that believe in me at the beginning more than I believed in myself. And then slowly, finally, you're building enough trust in yourself that actually you start making better decisions because your heart has been screaming for a long time saying this is not good for us, but you're numbing it and putting it away, whether it's through addictions or busyness or just general kind of performance in front of everyone else. So the heart isn't heard anymore and the heart doesn't trust. And so it will start to sabotage, And so I've noticed, for me personally, I can't lead people into a sense of freedom. My name means freedom, the free man. So I've always been obsessed with people's own inner freedom. And I can't do that unless I do that with myself. And so freedom for me is the inner dialogue between, especially when I'm getting it wrong, not when I'm getting it right, but actually when I'm getting it wrong. And then I remember having a conversation with a guy that I believe is incredibly honorable to other people. I've never heard him criticize another person in my life. He's always able to really love people where they're at.
Aren't those people the best? The people that I've never heard say, I think that's probably one of the best attributes of somebody is that if you can say that about somebody, I've never heard them say a bad thing about anybody else in their life. That's such an honorable, great. It's like people that do that just tend to have really great vibes and you want to be around them. And
a total giant. Like he's incredibly tender, but also incredibly successful because he has created and cultivated a huge amount of trust. It's been interesting to even listen to. There was a research project done a few years ago from one of the bosses. In fact, he's involved in the Orphan Myth campaign. And they did a study on the top 300 CEOs in America. And they spent like a year researching, interviewing all the people around these very successful giants of their industry, whatever the industry was. And they looked at character. They looked at the character of these people. And one of the things was how they would take the successful ones are the ones that were kind of marking out the greatest productivity. They would take responsibility when things were going wrong, but they would always give credit where it was due to other people when it was going right. And they always found a way to never project blame or criticism, but always try and find solutions to problems as if it was a team effort. And so it was just quite inspiring listening to that project because I just saw this rubric that they basically created of these very successful leaders of huge corporations were successful because of their character. Of course, they had talents and gifts and skill sets, but they also had the sense of confidence that allowed them to have a lot of no people around them. Yeah. And I would say that I've grown so much more when I've actually been able to create enough trust with myself. Therefore, I create better trust with other people because I'm not being half as critical or half as terrified because I'm constantly waiting for something to go wrong. And on top of that, I would say there's this power of being able to see the brilliance in other people and knowing that people think the best of you. And that in itself makes you thrive and makes you want to take many more risks and be more courageous and try things out. because you've got a safety net of their belief in you.
Yeah. And it's that abundance mindset, that abundance mentality, right? To be able to see all of the opportunity and all of the good that can not just happen for you or those closest to you, but for everybody. And then when you see that in other people, then you tend to see it a lot more in yourself. One of the things when we hire at our business, at our agency, when we hire people, really, I'm asking whatever questions you ask in an interview, and I'm like, vetting people. But really, the two things in my mind, and I now think about this in other life situations as well. But and I stole this from somebody, I can't remember who, maybe Marriott or something, Covey somewhere. But character and competence, like just looking at those two things, because competence is trainable. Like competence is what you're good at, what you know, the skill set, what you went to school for, what you've spent your time learning. But character is very difficult to train. But in a work setting, at least, you need somebody that can come in and be a person of high character that's going to contribute in way more ways than just those competencies that they have, because those things you can train, and character you can't. So
the difference between David Brooks actually talked about this in The Road to Character. He talked about there being two Adams. The Adams that go after the resume virtues. So that's the skill set, the things that are on your resume that impress people. And then you've got the second Adam that is always looking at the eulogy virtues, the things that people talk about you at the funeral. He said, but like 90% of the world, honestly, are only looking at the resume virtues, whereas we could thrive a lot better if we started looking at the eulogy virtues.
I couldn't agree more.
Confidence.
Yeah. Okay. So I asked about the self-worth, and the reason why is because, so I talked to Brian, is it Mavis?
Yes.
Okay.
AKB.
Yeah. So he's awesome. And we had a great conversation yesterday. And we talked about, with orphans specifically, and with this project, with the Orphan Myth Project, we were talking about, and all of the work that he does with his foundation.
Oh, so good.
America's Kids Belong, right? So we were talking about how this problem is sometimes dehumanized by, whatever, all of the different, inputs that we have coming in, and it's hard. And one of the things that he did, the reason this came up is because, as you know, he started interviewing these foster kids on camera and then putting those on the internet for people to be able to come and access when they were when they were going through this process. And it humanized these kids. It wasn't like, I don't have time for this, or, I don't have whatever, I don't have the resources, I don't have the whatever. With all of the excuses you can make, when you watch the video, you're like, oh, that's a human being. That and that's why I asked about the self-worth, is because when you can appreciate that every single person has self-worth and everybody deserves opportunity, if nothing else, to turn that, self-worth and that potential into something great. And you can humanize that process, then, that's, I think that's a big part of what the Orphan Myth is trying to do. It's trying to demystify, or, get rid of these myths of the orphans and of orphans all over the world. And so just to reiterate what those were, if you listen to yesterday's episode, and you'll hear the others as well. But the first myth being that kids in orphanages have no parents or family. That's something that, and again, it's not something that I've consciously really thought of, but in the back of your mind, you just have that myth floating around, right?
Yeah.
And the fact is that children are often living in institutions as a result of poverty, and as many as 70 to 80% have a living parent or relatives in the community who could care for them with the right support. The second myth is there are no orphans in the USA. We talked all about that as well, how we don't have orphans in the States. I don't know why, but we do, right? It's just called something different. And so the actuality of it is there are over 420,000 children in the United States foster care system. The majority of them need a loving foster family while they wait to return to their biological families. 100,000 will never be able to return home and are waiting to be adopted. And as Mike told us in our conversation, that's not a static number. Every day that's going up and down, and more up than down, which is the problem.
Yeah.
And that's just the US. We're not even talking about the global problem, which we may touch on a little bit more today. And then the myth number 3 is that that the problem is not solvable. There's no solution for this problem. And the fact is that it is solvable, and solutions have already been developed and proven successful. And so that's where the Orphan Myth Project steps in, right? So talk to me about your affiliation with and the work that you're doing for Orphan Myth.
Well, to go back one, sometimes it helps to have context for why. And if I get in something like this that feels like such a huge global problem, and I'm a 3 on the Enneagram, so I like to feel like I can be productive and be effective and get things done. So normally a project like this feels, and I think a lot of the time, I think a lot of the time people are just kind of like turning their eyes another way because it just feels so huge. But that was kind of the same thing with sex trafficking 10, 15 years ago. And people were like, this just feels too enormous. And the beauty of the same team that we have for this is that they were going on about this, the problems with trafficking 15 years ago when it wasn't trendy.
Yeah.
So I was actually involved in anti-sex trafficking, and I still am on a huge level. And I have many friends who have founded many charities for that particular issue. But one of the things that I noticed more and more was asking their backgrounds, where these kids were coming from, where the trafficked were finding themselves in, why they were finding it so easy to fall into this particular area. And one of the major statistics that keeps showing up again and again, both homelessness, incarceration and trafficking, is that a lot of these, if not over 50, so 80% in Los Angeles, for example, of traffic victims actually were in foster care. 80%.
That's incredible. That's way too high. Yeah.
75% of those incarcerated in America were in the foster care system at some point.
75%?
50% of homelessness were in foster care at some point.
Wow.
So the main reason I think why, and forgive me for speaking for the rest of the team, but the reason why we are all so passionate about this is if we catch up the problems upstream, which is reforming the foster care system in the United States of America, as well as being able to navigate reunifying children back to their homes or finding them a forever family, a safe and loving family, if they can't go back to their families globally, then we would actually catch up all of those things upstream and reduce significantly the numbers of what we're seeing play out. And one of the reasons why I trust this team so much and all the nonprofits that they're partnering with is that they are providing actual effective solutions. And I know a lot of the time, a lot of pastors, a lot of ministers in America are actually going, how effective is our tithing? And are we actually seeing results take place? I think sometimes we think, and forgive me for saying this, but I think even myself as a Christian, like, well, I gave the money, so I've done my job. We're great.
Yeah, they're doing something with it.
Yeah, and you look like trustworthy people. That's fantastic.
Yeah,
So,
pastor.
But I'm taking care of the orphans by giving a bit of money. That's what I do. And as a single, I'm like, well, I'll wait until I'm married, and then I'll maybe foster and adopt and all this kind of thing. So one of the things I find really interesting is I myself was like, well, we'll just put that for the side of someone that's got the calling or the grace for it. Maybe I don't have that, And then I'm reading more and more the mandate for all of us to actually be involved in this, the mandate that says you need to take care of the orphans and the widows, the amount of times that orphans were taken care of at the birth of the early church. And it was a huge social justice moment in the birth of the early church, was taking care of the orphans. And scholars will tell you about all of that side of the journey, which I won't even go into. But for me, we've got a lot of Christians that are fighting pro-life. But I remember sitting down with someone not too long ago, and they said the problem is the foster care system is so overwhelmed and so overburdened that why would anyone want to try and keep their child and give it to the foster care system if they can't take care of it themselves? And I thought it's so interesting. We're very passionate about pro-life, but I don't see as many as passionate about taking care of children and adopting. That lovely stat that Brian probably already checked in with which was, if you've got 400,000 churches in America and you've only got 130,000 children that can't legally go back to their homes, they have to be adopted by somebody else. That means that it's less than one family in every church to actually take care of this issue. It doesn't have great word of mouth marketing though, fostering. You hear an awful lot of the time that parents couldn't cope anymore, or they were overburdened. So we're actually trying to push an awful lot onto wraparound support, which is where me as a single comes in and go, I actually can help. So it might just be that I Grubhub some pizza over to a friend that's a single foster parent and has just had a really intense day. It might be that I take care of the kids for a couple of hours while they just get some time out. And what we've noticed is wraparound support, which would be all of those things included, is not a huge amount of sacrifice for us. But it's an extraordinary gift for those that have taken in the heart to want to be able to take care of foster children and or adopt. One of the things that I think is fascinating is that the church have actually donate over $1 billion a year to orphan care in America. That's an extraordinary amount of generosity. And because of our generosity, it's essentially been taken advantage of now, because people have gone, well, this is fantastic business.
Yeah.
And so the encouragement of families to separate their children, parents are actually as much, almost as much of a victim as the children, because they're going through a poverty journey. They hear that the orphanage will take care of them better. So, of course, parents in their own self-sacrifice will go, well, I want the very best for my child. So if that means that they get to be taken care of better, then I'll hold the tears and wave goodbye to my child. So it's a very painful process to watch. In some ways you can understand it. They're like, they need better education. They need food. And so that's why a lot of encouragement of like, yeah, they should have better care. But actually the emotional trauma of separation is much worse than not having great amounts of education.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're trying. Psychologists are just recognizing that institutional living for children is just brutal on all levels of psychosis, on the physical elements of the body. IQ as well is never, if you take a child out of an institution into a loving home, their IQ even increases because of the amount of individual attention that they finally got. And so we've actually seen some of the NGO partners that we do have on the campaign have actually found effective ways to reuse orphanages that were once full, emptying the orphanages by getting the children back into family homes. And then what they're doing is reusing the orphanages to be able to then take in the street children, of which in certain cities and countries, the ratio is 12 street children to 1 orphan.
Jeez.
So just that alone, they're, instead of them taking care of 200 children, they're now taking care of 1,500 children a year. And so those are the partners that we're actually working with. We actually don't want the church to stop funding orphanages. We want them to start re-educating, because the biggest fear that we have is that everyone stops donating to orphanages. What we want is to pivot the funds so that it goes into more localized expertise, so that it really is the benefit of the children and the emotional benefit of the children, and causing less and less trauma. And of course, it's a sensitive subject, because there are orphanages out there doing extraordinary things, taking in children that don't have two parents.
Yeah.
And don't have at least, so we have to be very sensitive on this nature, and equally not make the church feel bad. We
talked about that. I talked about that again. And you know what, I don't know the order of how these episodes are going to come out. So maybe you haven't heard the conversation with Brian yet. I thought about that. If you haven't, then it's coming. So be ready, because we've referenced that conversation a few times. Okay. But we did talk about that, is how you can't, there's still a problem, but that doesn't mean that you can place judgment on all of the previous attempts or the previous organizations or what, you know what I mean? It's not to say that, it's just to say that let's get smarter and better and organize this in a way that's better.
Yeah.
So
we're refreshing our reflections on it. And in new studies and new research, we're like, oh, we're finding better methods and better solutions for this now. So, yeah. So
the way that the Orphan Myth, this campaign, which launches March 22nd, and is really a big push. I know there's going to be a big push for a solid, I think, week or 10 days or something, right? Where people will be seeing it on social media, and there's a lot of influencers that are involved. And this big push is the campaign is the 100% participation campaign, which is kind of what you said. And again, there's a lot of problems like this, but this especially is one of those problems where you say, I hear you, I understand, that's terrible. Well, I can't do anything about it. So because that's the process. I don't have time for that. I don't have resources for that or whatever. Right. And so what I like about this campaign, when I talked with Lindsay about it initially, and the reason that I think a lot of our people, our listeners will really appreciate this, is because this 100% participation campaign is built in a way that you can be supportive and help the cause and absolutely make a huge dent in this problem without taking that first baby step, I guess, into helping solve a problem that definitely exists and is terrible, without having to go sign up right now to be a foster parent, right? And say, I can make that happen. So tell me about the 100% participation campaign, and specifically how anybody that is listening can get involved in that and make something out of it.
So we're looking at many different sectors to be able to help towards this. So this isn't just a church, even though the church is the most generous stakeholder in this particular concern. One of the, my part really as a pastor is to kind of get the faith-based area of the world and America to actually get involved with this campaign. So it really can look, we're trying to make it almost bespoke to everyone that reaches out. It might be wraparound support. It might just be that you've got a group of friends that you have a book club with. You're like, hey, let's do something for our local community and get involved in the 100% participation campaign. So there are many different ways of doing it. It could be involved in wraparound support for local foster care system. It could be that we start re-educating from the front in churches. Hey guys, for those that have been, they sometimes call it orphan tourism, where people go and volunteer their work and their time to orphanages. We need to just change that approach. And instead, we actually need to start creating more of a focus on localized expertise rather than feeding into institutions. But also at the same time, we need to actually just start re-educating. We need to have these conversations. I mean, the stuff that I've learned in the last year, I didn't know.
Yeah.
And so really my heart as a pastor is reaching out to the rest of American churches going, this is the number one thing that we as American church can all unify on. We can all unite on the fact that we all agree that orphans must be taken care of. It's a mandate that we were given, and we need to make sure we follow this through effectively. And so essentially it's getting pastors, group leaders, people in small communities or big communities to actually create a way, no matter how big or small, to be 100% participating in this area, because everyone can do something. And to start to turn our eyes, actually, it's almost like the word I got was like, start looking at this issue rather than turning the eyes away. Because if we all came together, it won't feel as burdensome for those that do feel like they can foster or can adopt. It isn't a hard task to start changing where we're funding into this particular issues. Take the same passions that you've had, congratulate yourself on the fact that you have been passionate about this in the first place, but shifts just slightly, just a slight shift, a slight pivot. It doesn't take a huge amount for us to all come together in 100% and actually radically change the way that we've been approaching this age-old problem and start to actually bring new effective solutions. So if there are pastors listening to us or people that are like, we've noticed the pastors that have been getting involved or are getting involved, their actual congregations are becoming a little bit more connected because they're actually focusing out on one issue and feeling a togetherness by helping their city. We've noticed even pastors, when they are taking on this issue from their own churches and leading from the front and being passionate about foster care or adoption, you actually see the numbers for the government in that particular state. We've seen it before, where the numbers that are waiting aren't the children waiting for a family. It's now the families are waiting for children because there's been such a push from the church.
Yeah, we talked about that with Brian in the conversation in Oklahoma, or in Colorado.
Yeah,
with some of the differences that they've seen, and flipping that script to say, instead of having lines of children waiting for hopefully eventually finding an adoptive family, to flip that to wait. The way he put it is to change who's waiting, to say, we want so many families ready to help and support these children that they'll be able to, the children will be who's up next. And, and that's, so the 100% participation campaign for Orphan Myth, you can go on orphanmyth.org and you can pre-register. It's right there on the homepage. You can go down and pre-register. And this is the thing, again, I like about it. I'm an owner of a small business, and, a team can get involved and go on and say, let's all put, whether it's, the thing about 100% participation, doesn't matter if you put in $100 or $1,000 or 50 cents. The idea is that you participated in, going back to self-worth. You feel that self-worth of like, look, I'm doing something good for these people, and making a difference. You can do it with a business, a church, family, organization of some sort, whatever it might be, you can go on and pre-register and put together, the team, I guess, to help with this 100% participation. So I have really thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, genuinely.
Yeah, I know. I really love talking to you. It's so fun to bounce back and forth with such a brilliant brain like yours.
Oh, geez, Louise, right back at you. So what are you working on right now? So we talked about the book, and I know this is about the Orphan Myth, but I also want to talk about the things that you're working on right now, and where. Look, if you just go Google your name, then there's plenty of video content. Trust me, I went and
which is actually one of the things that I ask people not to do, because I dread to think what comes out, especially if there's a guy that I quite like and I meet him in a hotel foyer or something and we're chatting away and he's like, let me get your number, and then they start Googling. I'm like, don't do it. Don't do it. YouTube.
Go to YouTube immediately. No,
I've grown over these many years.
Everybody does, and that's great. It's you've done some amazing interviews. You've been involved in a lot of really positive things. So tell us what you're working on currently, other than Orphan Myth, and where people can connect with you if they want. If you don't want anybody to connect with you, just say don't connect with me. Don't
call me. I've got a podcast, the Carry On podcast, which I actually really might get you on it. I'm not joking.
Hey, I'd love to. I really would. That'd be great.
Yeah, and I've just turned 40. So I say just, actually I did last year, and I still like to believe that it was only yesterday.
Continue saying just until.
Yeah, exactly. Until a couple of months time when I turned 41. Yeah. But one of the things that I kind of in prayer is like, I guess if I don't find a significant other by this point, then I will probably start looking at training to be a foster carer myself, especially with what we were researching the last year. So I'm starting to look into that now. And look at what that would look like. Although I'm in Los Angeles at the moment, my heart would be, if I can, to be just useful for the foster care system and really put into practice what I've been preaching, and recognizing, it's not necessarily just a grace and calling. It's when we say yes, amazing things happen. So this is probably the most terrifying time of my life, is to take on something that I'm an only child. So I've never been used to having siblings running around or anything like that. It's a big thing for me to say yes to, especially as a single, because I'm not going to have necessarily a teammate to be able to do this through. And I realize I don't carry the things that a father would have in these moments. So it's building community. And so I've been writing about that on Patreon. And Patreon has been really great, because I've been talking about being single as a pastor, and I've been talking just about the navigations of being a pastor in the 21st century, and just navigating what it looks like in this day and age. I have a big heart for the secular world and the industry. I'm often in the film industry as well, and doing all sorts of writing. So it's interesting. I talk an awful lot about stewarding the kingdom in the secular world. So I'm still writing, coaching occasionally for those particular subjects as well. And just kind of seeing what this world brings in the next year or two.
That's incredible. I'm excited for you. And we'll be rooting for you as you're going through this transition. If you ever have questions about parenting, I've got 4 kids.
Please. Whoa.
Ranging from 5 months, 6 months, Betty, all the way up to 9. And they're the best, but it's busy.
Do you sleep? That's my question.
My wife is definitely going to listen to this, and I'm going to say that I sleep less than I would, but she definitely sleeps less than me. So especially with a newborn. So big shout out to my wife. It's when kids are sick this week, they've got little sniffles, and those nights are long. But you know what? It's the best thing in the world when you see come home and get the run to the door. There's nothing better. So, super great pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for taking the time, and thanks for the time you're putting into this incredible project. I know it's something that you're obviously passionate about, and it's impacting so many lives, and I'm happy in this very small way to be able to hopefully, help the cause a little bit. You participated in the 100% participation campaign. Are you sending me a badge or something? Do I get a pin? You get a small badge and a Starbucks gift card. Okay. Anybody listening, if Carrie will send you, just email her. We'll send you a Starbucks gift card. Thank you so much, Carrie. It's a great pleasure to have you on. We'll talk to you soon. We'll be in touch. Hello, it's Corey here, and I just want to thank you so much for listening into the Hope Strategy Podcast. I hope you're enjoying it as much as we are enjoying having these amazing conversations with these incredible individuals talking about hope. We'd love it if you wouldn't mind liking, subscribing, and leaving us a review on iTunes or Spotify or anywhere that you listen to your podcasts, and share it with anybody you feel that can benefit from these messages of hope. Thank you so much for listening to the Hope Strategy Podcast.